Why would the fate of Europe's second largest wetland complex be linked to 7 water buffalo? Because the Danube Delta can still look alive from above, while water beneath the reed cover loses oxygen. The delta has been on the UNESCO World Heritage List since 1991, yet more than a century of dams, canals, and drainage changed how water moved through its wetlands. Slow water turns stagnant, fish begin to vanish, and migratory birds leave feeding grounds that no longer support them. The green surface hides the damage, not the recovery. Reeds have expanded across more than 220,000 hectares. Inside that reed zone lies Omer Island, near the border of Romania and Ukraine, where the break in water exchange can be read on a map. The wider Danube Delta covers more than 4,000 square kilometers, larger than Luxembourg, and has been listed by UNESCO since 1991. For thousands of years, Europe's second longest river fed this ground in cycles. Water passed through marsh channels, spread sediment, carried oxygen, and delivered nutrients into shallow lakes. Dark silt gathered at the waterline. Reeds moved with a dry, dense rustle. A quiet side channel could still look alive even when its current had slowed. Then the timeline shifts to the Soviet period. Engineers built many dikes and canals not to refresh the island, but to block water and redirect land use. Wetlands were drained step by step, then converted into large-scale farmland. More fields appeared. More production followed. The hydrology changed first. The vegetation came later. After drainage, Omer no longer received the Danube's continuous inflow. Once the steady Danube inflow was cut, reeds rose across Omer to 2 to 4 meters and eventually covered 80 to 100% of the island. From above, the surface still read as vegetation, not damage. Green cover. Under that cover, the sequence was mechanical and quiet. Dense stems blocked sunlight, shaded the water surface, and slowed photosynthesis in submerged plants and algae. In the muffled dark water beneath the reed wall, dissolved oxygen fell below 2 milligrams per liter. For many freshwater fish, strong physiological stress begins near 3 milligrams per liter, so this was already a survival threshold. Spawning grounds shrank as shallow, oxygenated water disappeared, and fish populations dropped by 30 to 60%. Then the losses moved upward as aquatic insects vanished with the oxygen and habitat, removing the food base for fish fry and many water birds. No open disaster. The frame stays green, while below the reeds, the dark water is almost empty of fish and insects. When oxygen fell below 2 milligrams per liter, the diagnosis moved from reeds to water movement. Decades of research pointed to one missing process: the seasonal rise of the Danube. In a natural marsh, this rise is a flood pulse. Muddy water enters low reed beds, carrying silt, oxygen, and dissolved nutrients. Then it spreads through shallow channels and renews the wetland from inside. Those flooded shallows give many freshwater fish a place to spawn, because warm, protected water holds eggs and young fish away from the main current. Before the dikes and canals, Omer Island received that pulse each flood season. After the barriers changed the flow, flood frequency dropped by more than 50 to 70%. The number matters. Less flooding meant less fresh oxygen, less suspended sediment, and fewer short-lived connections between pools. On Omer Island, the annual water level moved only around 10 centimeters. Nearby natural wetlands rose and fell by nearly 1 meter. A few dozen centimeters can decide whether a side channel connects to a marsh or remains sealed off. 1 meter opens passages, 10 centimeters leaves a flat surface. The image changes fast. Brown floodwater with suspended silt becomes a still sheet with no visible current. For engineers, the next step was no longer removing reeds first. They had to physically bring Danube water back onto the island. Once the diagnosis pointed to stalled water exchange, crews opened the first cut on Omer Island in 2009. A section of dike came out, and Danube water entered old marshes again with mud, moisture, and slow current. First breach, real flow. In 2021 to 2022, the intervention widened when another 200 to 300 meters of dikes were removed. During seasonal rises, thousands of hectares flooded again, and shallow water returned to places where young fish can feed and hide. In the reed fields, new channels formed where water had barely moved for decades. The first measurable result: 4 to 6 milligrams of dissolved oxygen per liter, with fish appearing again in the channels. The oxygen reading had climbed to 4 to 6 milligrams per liter, yet the return flow still stopped against reed beds that had accumulated for decades. The problem shifted. Water existed, but passage did not. Across thousands of hectares, old stems formed a tight wall, and shallow channels ended inside packed vegetation. Frame 1, a solid screen of reeds, dry stalks rubbing with a hard rasp. Frame 2, a buffalo hoof sinks into black mud, then lifts with a wet sucking sound. Frame 3, between broken stems, a small window of open water holds light. That was the gap Rewilding Europe and Rewilding Ukraine wanted to create repeatedly, without cutting new channels through every blocked patch. The contrast mattered. Ordinary cattle usually choose firmer, drier pasture because narrow hooves bite into saturated ground and limit movement. Water buffalo, Bubalus bubalus, are built for wet ground. Broad hooves spread body mass across soft soil, reducing how far each step drops. They also wallow and feed inside reed beds, so their daily path crosses places where tractors and standard vehicles can bog down. Each passage did a small mechanical job. Stems bent, old reed litter cracked, mud compressed, and water stayed in the openings left behind. Not a highway, a chain of pockets. Over time, those pockets could reconnect flooded patches that looked wet from above, but remained closed at ground level. The animals did not replace hydrology. They made the returned water usable inside the marsh. This was not an alien species dropped into the delta. Around 100 years earlier, water buffalo still lived in parts of the Danube Delta, before drainage and changing farming practices reduced their presence. The starting scale stayed deliberately small, 7 animals against thousands of hectares of marsh. For launch, the project chose only 7 buffalo, and the next task was getting them onto an isolated island. In May 2019, the first 7 water buffalo stepped from a barge onto Omer Island. That landing was the end of a route, not the beginning, because the team had first moved the animals from Transcarpathia in western Ukraine, more than 1,000 kilometers away from the marsh. Scientists looked there because buffalo still lived around wetlands, mud, and small farms in that part of Ukraine. Before departure, veterinarians examined the herd and vaccinated each animal, reducing the risk of disease entering a recovering wetland. No shortcut existed. The animals had to cross the country by road, with handlers keeping them stable through a long transfer before the delta section even began. After days on land, the convoy reached Vilkovo, on the Ukrainian side of the Danube Delta. Vilkovo sits among river channels near the Kilia branch, which makes it one of the practical access points for islands that roads do not reach. From there, the transport team loaded the herd onto barges and moved deeper into the marsh, where reeds, water, and soft ground replaced regular infrastructure. The released group was small and specific: 5 males, 2 females, and 1 pregnant female. Once unloading finished, the plan changed from transport to restraint. No fences, no barns, no extra feed. The people left the bank, and Omer held only buffalo, water, and reeds. After the release in May 2019, 7 buffalo moved across Omer without pens or feeders. Within a short period, the change registered from the air. It began in the material underfoot. Old reed, dry on top and matted below, started to fail. A buffalo eats about 25 to 40 kilograms of reeds and wetland plants each day. Across the herd, that becomes about 150 to 250 tons of vegetation a year. That removal mattered, but the larger shift came from movement. Half a ton on wet ground leaves a record. Hooves pressed into the old reed mat and cracked the dry stems. The sound was sharp. Under the broken layer, black mud took the pressure with a thick, sticky pull. Water then entered the narrow track, dark and slow, where stems had blocked it for decades. A strip became a channel. This is why the change spread beyond feeding spots. Water buffalo have broad, splayed hooves, useful on soft, wet ground, and every crossing widened the same weak lines. The dense cover opened in seams, not in clean squares. Once the reed roof broke, sunlight reached the water surface again. Light changed the water. On exposed patches, soft mud hollows and shallow pools reappeared. These small warm pockets usually fill quickly with insects, larvae, and fish fry. Wetland scientists describe this process as grazing plus trampling disturbance, a known force in reedbed mosaics. The Danube Delta is also a UNESCO biosphere reserve, where small habitat differences carry real weight. The manure added another layer. The herd produces about 100 to 150 tons of dung each year. It returns nutrients, including nitrogen and phosphorus, onto wet soil. Seeds also move with the animals, either through digestion or stuck in mud on the hooves. Across the island, that meant more than 200 plant species could travel through the same paths. Reeds were eaten, mats were crushed, water returned, and nutrients shifted. No single action did it. The surface changed through repeated contact between bodies, stems, mud, and water. Inside the former solid reed bed, the first open water windows and mud hollows began to form. After the buffalo cut their first corridors, reed stands across Omer Island thinned to 50 to 70% in many areas. The change no longer stayed local. Hooves broke old reed mats in wet ground. Water entered the gaps, leaving shallow pools, black mud, and natural paths that had been absent for decades. Ecologists also reintroduced conic horses, using a different grazing layer on drier ground. Buffalo kept breaking old reed in flooded zones, while conics fed on young grasses where the soil held firmer. The breed is known for poor wet pastures and long open grazing without stables. In one landscape, mud windows, tracks, and young grass began appearing together. With the reed wall opened, water stopped hiding under a roof of stems. Sunlight reached the surface again, and oxygen settled near 4 to 6 milligrams per liter. That range matters. Many freshwater fish can remain there, while 2 milligrams or less brings oxygen stress for many species. The first frame is water glittering through reed gaps. Small ripples cross a shallow channel where insect larvae and young fish move along the edge. Above the new openings, wingbeats cut across the marsh. The food chain is visible again, not as scenery, but as a sequence. Aquatic insects responded first, rising by roughly 30 to 70%. Larvae of midges, mayflies, and dragonflies often track freshwater quality, so their return signaled more than motion in the mud. They fed the next layer. Perch, young pike, and carp began reappearing in the shallow channels, where vegetated margins give fry cover from predators. Then the larger signs arrived overhead. Waterbirds increased by about 20 to 50% in some zones, following the fish in open water. White storks, gray herons, and the Dalmatian pelican became visible again above Omer Island. The Dalmatian pelican is among Europe's rarest large birds and depends on fish-rich wetlands for feeding. The island no longer read as one sealed reed mass. Natural water labyrinths crossed the marsh, and the first buffalo calves were born on ground once treated as nearly lifeless. In only a few years, fish rose 1.5 to 2 times, and birds by 20 to 50%. A few years after fish numbers climbed by 1.5 to 2 times and white storks returned, Omer faced a different test, keeping those changes measured. From above, the picture still looked like recovery, with birds crossing the Danube Delta and open water cutting through reed fields. At ground level, the story changed. Since 2022, the war in Ukraine has made research along the Danube border zone harder, especially where boats, field teams, and sampling routes depend on access. The delta also stretches across Romania and Ukraine before the river reaches the Black Sea, so a gap in one border sector can leave a blind strip in the record. That is the contrast. A marsh can gain fish, insects, and birds, while the measuring work behind that recovery becomes thinner. Some wildlife tracking programs, water testing rounds, and restoration checks have been reduced or interrupted, and that removes the long series of data needed to catch decline early. The camera moves from returning birds to a field notebook with fewer entries, then to sample bottles that no longer leave the landing on schedule. For a wetland, missing months matter because oxygen, flow, and reed cover can change before the change is obvious from the air. The second risk comes from climate. Models for the Danube region show another 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of warming in the coming decades, a shift large enough to alter drought pressure and water levels. If flow from the Danube drops, some restored marshes can lose shallow water again, and the open patches that fed insects and young fish start closing. The dry edge appears first. Pale mud, a hard line where water sat, brittle reed stems breaking underfoot. Less open water remains between the reed walls, and the marsh begins to return to the same blocked pattern that restoration tried to undo. The third risk is direct drainage. WWF Romania warns that around 2,500 hectares of wetlands in the Danube region still face possible conversion for agriculture, a large area for one delta zone. The Danube Delta has been on the UNESCO World Heritage List since 1991, which makes lost monitoring more than a local administrative problem. It affects a protected wetland known for broad reed beds, fish nurseries, and bird migration routes across Europe. Omer's recovery therefore depends on 3 safeguards at once: field records, stable water exchange, and protection from another round of drainage. Around 2,500 hectares in the region could still be drained again. After those remaining drainage risks, Omer's lesson becomes clearer. Recovery rests on water, grazing, and time. Since 2022, war near the Delta has made fieldwork harder. Regional warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees adds another pressure. New drainage would cut the same water exchange again. That is the contrast. A few years earlier, Omor was still a stagnant marsh. Reed beds covered almost everything, and open shallows had nearly vanished. People did not rebuild the island with concrete walls, heavy earthworks, or large engineering structures. They reopened flow, returned large grazers, and let the Danube move through the site. For wetlands, that link to the main channel usually decides the outcome. It renews water, carries oxygen, and lets juvenile fish enter nursery shallows. Once water moved again, buffalo and conic horses changed the surface. Hooves opened paths through reed mats and kept young shoots lower. Mud shifted under them. Channels widened. Shallow feeding zones returned where reed walls had closed the marsh for decades. Fish appeared in the shallows because water no longer sat isolated from the Danube. Then the biological signal moved above the water. Aquatic insects returned to wet margins and birds crossed the marsh again. White shapes over reeds, dark water below. The island was not restored by one build, but by returning missing conditions in sequence. Flow first, grazers next, time after that. This result is not locked in place. If flow weakens or reeds close the passages, the marsh can slide backward. For now, water runs again through open channels between reed fields, and birds pass over the Danube wetlands.